Good evening. Welcome to Iowa News and Views. I'm back. I've been away. I've been over in Des Moines, first-year freshman state senator from Iowa City, Johnson County, and I want to say it's been a very interesting experience, but it's great to be back on the show. I'd like to thank our guest hosts, Derek Maurer and Rusty Martin, who did the heavy lifting, as well as our all-volunteer crew that kind of kept things rolling. While I did join you a few times from Des Moines by phone, it's just not the same as being here. So thanks for tuning in. We have a great show tonight. We're going to be talking about the proposed changes to Iowa's Constitution, also known as the Stanley Amendments. And we're going to be talking about how that's going to maybe have an effect on education in Iowa. This show tonight is the first of two shows that we're going to be focusing on the constitutional amendments, because we think it's very important to bring people up to speed on our perspective about the nature of these amendments and whether they make sense or not. And I hope that you'll stick with us for the next few minutes to learn more about it. I'd like to start, before I introduce our guest, talking a little bit about what's proposed. There are two amendments proposed. There are amendments that have passed in two sessions of the Iowa legislature already, which is required for them to be put before voters. We're going to be asked to go to the polls on June 29th to vote on these two questions. The first question basically says that we will limit state government spending at 99% of the revenues which we take in. It's something that we currently already do. We put that into the Iowa Code in 1992. It seems to be working just fine and makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty easy to do when you're in good economic times. The other amendment is a little bit more controversial, if you will. It requires that there be a 60% majority vote to pass any state tax increase, be it income tax or sales tax, to name a couple. And that would be essentially minority rule, if you will, 60% to pass a tax increase. A lot of people think that makes sense, but some people don't. The amendments are something more than 2,000 words. They're being promoted primarily by the taxpayers, Iowans for Tax Relief, through their political action committee, Taxpayers United, which has contributed almost $750,000 to state candidates over the last 6 years to promote their agenda on this. The amendment, the primary supporter is a guy named David Stanley. He's a former legislator and a Muscatine businessman who, frankly, has made this his life's work over the last 20 years in his crusade to change Iowa's Constitution. So there's your background. Our guest tonight, we're very happy to have Dr. Lew Finch, who is the Cedar Rapids Superintendent of Schools. Dr. Finch has had a long career in education. He has actually been a superintendent in Jefferson County, Colorado, and also in Anoka, Minnesota. He has received, has been selected as one of the top outstanding school executives in North America. Thank you for being here, Dr. Finch. Our other guest is Jolene Franken. Jolene, for the last year, has been the president of the Iowa State Education Association. That's our association of more than 32,000 teaching professionals in Iowa, and we're pleased to have you with us as well. She also has been a teacher for the last 30 years, beginning in Sutherland, has also been in Spencer, and most recently in Denison.
That's correct.
And she'll be providing a perspective from our teachers in our state tonight. These amendments are a good deal of concern to educators in Iowa because of the concern that if state government cannot meet its budget needs with schools, that local school boards are going to have to find the money. Dr. Finch, have local school boards been managing well with the resources that they tax for?
Well, Joe, before we get started, I want to kind of state a disclaimer.
Go ahead.
I'm not speaking on behalf of the Cedar Rapids Board of Education or the Cedar Rapids School District, and these are really my views and not necessarily the views of the Board of Education, so we want to make that very clear. I believe that boards of education are managing the resources quite well. A couple of years ago, we invited the local Chamber of Commerce in Cedar Rapids to do an audit of the business expenditures in our school district, and after a year of looking at those, I guess I can still see the headlines of the report when the audit committee announced that there was no wanton waste in the school district. And I would suggest that we're typical of most school districts. So I think the short answer to that is absolutely.
So we're managing well. That's my sense as well. Jolene, in terms of these amendments, do we need these amendments at this time? Do we need to change Iowa's Constitution to ratchet down on state government? And
there's a great deal of concern amongst the people that I've talked to a lot. From the standpoint of we teach majority rules, this makes minority rule, and what happens with the 60% majority. The other thing is that Iowa's history has been built on families, and families settled Iowa to begin with. Schools were extremely important to those families. Their local towns were important, and their counties later on. This takes the decision-making power away from that local control, which Iowa's been built on, and etches it in stone at the state level in the Constitution, which really destroys the amount of flexibility of being able to deal with the decisions that we have to deal with financially and programming-wise in schools.
Dr. Finch, this is a 2,000-word amendment. There's some folks are saying that it's really hard to anticipate all the things that it might do down the road. We're in good economic times right now. The state has adequate resources. We haven't had a tax increase for a number of years, the sales tax in '92, but income taxes was sometime in the '70s. What are the potential impacts that superintendents around the state are concerned about with these amendments?
Well, Joe, I think that those the answers to that are still not clear. The supporters of this would maintain that there would be no appreciable decline in support for public schools. Those of us, including myself, who have worked in states that have gone through similar kinds of action would suggest otherwise. In Colorado, for example, while I was serving as superintendent of schools there, they passed Amendment 1, it's called. It's a tax and spending limitation to the Constitution. We cut $26 million the very first year from our school district budget. We gutted it.
Wow.
If you have any friends or relatives who are familiar with what happened with Prop 13 in California, they are still suffering from the consequences of that. So all the rhetoric that we hear about the fact that it's not going to hurt public schools, those of us who've gone through that say nonsense. It will have a dramatic impact, negative impact on public school education.
So this question, Jolene, you hit on is minority rule, that if you need 60%, lots of things you need 50% plus one
Right.
to get elected to a school board, to get elected to the legislature. It seems kind of undemocratic that we would say that there's 150 members of the legislature and you could have 21 senators basically stop a good idea.
And we have that happen with bond issues also for schools. They'll pass by 58%, which in a popular election, 58% is considered a landslide victory, but it's not enough to approve building a new school or making improvements on a school. And as Dr. Finch pointed out earlier tonight, it's very interesting that these two amendments can pass by a popular vote, but we're putting in place a 60% majority. I have to wonder about that.
So what are teachers saying about these amendments?
They're very concerned about what's going to happen to their programs in their schools. We know that the 99% spending cap in state statute has worked, but it's never been tested in a downturn economy. It's been good times since 1992. What happens if we start into a recession type situation? Then is it going to work? And if it doesn't, do we cut back programs? Do we cut back people who are employed by the schools in order to maintain? If we don't, where does the money come from? It falls back on property tax, is my understanding. And the biggest users of property tax are schools and counties and cities, community colleges.
Another implication of that kind of thinking of needing supermajority to pass something is that we've grown to the point where we don't trust our state legislators. Dr. Finch, do you think we have reason not to trust our state legislators? Do the folks generally, in your mind, doing a good job?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of trust. I think that if you take a look at our legislators, they're doing what they think is best. I mean, they're reflecting what they believe to be the will of the people quite often, and I don't think that they really have a good feel for the will of the people always, but it's not a matter of trust. I think in Iowa we have historically We've had honesty and integrity in our elected officials. That includes board members and legislators. We just have an honest difference of opinion here. And in our opinion, this is not a good piece of legislation that was passed by the last two houses of the General Assembly. We believe that, going back to what Jolene mentioned, the idea of requiring a supermajority just flies in the face of the one person, one vote. And I can't imagine that any of us would go out and purposely sell ourselves out by voting for these amendments and allow a minority of the legislators, as few as, 21 senators, could block this. And when we take a look at the funding for education and how difficult it has been in the past few years, even during good economic times, it's been very difficult for us to get adequate funding for education. And those votes are usually very close. Those of us who are who are responsible for carrying this out are very dubious about the legislature actually adequately funding education, particularly given the fact they could, as few as 21 senators could block this.
So what I'm hearing, I guess, as a brief summary, is that if you're concerned about having better education in Iowa, which we've had a fairly significant debate about the last few years as reading scores have fallen off some, and we're trying to address class size reduction, that these amendments are potentially going to have a very negative effect on our current education system in the state. One issue that didn't get dealt with this legislative session is going to be back is the whole issue of crumbling schools and school infrastructure. The state fire marshal indicates that there are some serious deficiencies in fairly significant numbers of buildings. As you pointed out, Dr. Finch, it's been difficult even in these good times for school boards to raise the resources they need to take care of infrastructure. What's going to be the impact on infrastructure, Dr. Finch, if this goes forward? Are we going to be able to meet those demands?
Well, of course, we have the supermajority in place right now for bond issues, and look at the history. I think over the past few years, only about 50% of the proposed bond issues have passed. Another quarter of those would have passed had there been a simple majority. And even in communities where buildings have actually been declared unusable, I mean, they've the fire marshal comes in and said that these are dangerous facilities, and even in some of those communities, they have not been able to pass a bond issue to construct schools. I don't see this particular amendment changing that. It's already in effect for the property tax, and it's very difficult. So all we have to do is take a look at the history of this and see what has happened with bond issues, and you've got a little bit of a hint about what's going to happen with overall funding, not only of schools, but everything else that depends on legislative action.
Sure. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We are at half point in the show. Boy, it's going by fast, isn't it? I hope you stick around. No clicking or flipping, whatever you do. We have a website, and you can check it out right here. I think it's on the screen. There it is. And we've got some pictures of our crew and information about the show, upcoming shows, past shows. You can learn about us. Also, we'd like to know what you think about the show. If you've got some ideas for some guests or some content, send us some email. We love to get email. We get lots of it from our viewers, and we hope you'll send us some too. We're visiting about the constitutional amendments, as you might have gathered. We are talking with Dr. Lew Finch, who's the Cedar Rapids School Superintendent, and Jolene Franken, who is the President of Iowa State Education Association. We're pleased to have him with us. Back to the content, there's a new law that was passed last year that allows for sales taxes to be raised, the local option, by 1%. How's that going over? Mr. Stanley believes that sales taxes really are the way to fund the state and local services. Are we finding that that's been an effective tool for school boards to deal with crumbling schools?
Where they have passed, yes, it is working, but they're not all passing. Living in Des Moines through the week, where my job is, Polk County lost their 1-cent sales tax by 43 votes.
That's right.
So it's very difficult to judge. Woodbury County, which is out in western Iowa, closer to where I'm from, they passed theirs very easily, and they will be able to use it very well for infrastructure and for that funding. But it's difficult to base everything on a sales tax, and as I understand these amendments, the 60% majority exempts property tax. It does not apply to that, and it also does not apply to the gas tax.
That's right.
So those are concerns.
So I want to shift focus a little bit. So we've talked about the amendments. We talked about some of the potential problems to school boards. I'm interested in getting some sense of what you think the motivation here is. We have a guy named David Stanley. He's been working for a long time to move this forward. He obviously believes in this cause. He's contributed almost $750,000, his organization, Taxpayers United, their political action committee, to mostly Republican candidates. They've given about $698,000, $94,000 to Republicans and $22,000 to Democrats over a 6-year period, basically to get those votes, line up that support. Jolene, do you think the Constitution's for sale in Iowa, that you can, if you spend enough money, you can change the Constitution? And is that a good thing to do?
That's a big concern. It really is. I'm also concerned about why he wants to do this. And I've had some people say to me, well, gee, if we go ahead and pass these, David Stanley will go away, and that will be the end of his 20-year effort. Wrong. According to the Des Moines Register newspaper this morning, when this show is being taped, there was an article that says this is just the beginning, and he still wants his taxpayer rights amendment put into the Constitution as well. So this has been a 20-year crusade, which we've been concerned about all the way along. You have to also be concerned about when this election is going to be held. June 29th is a date when a lot of people are gone, going on vacation, or in summer school. There are lots of problems with a June 29th date. I really have to wonder why a taxpayer rights group, a group that's very concerned about taxation, would want to spend $1.5 to $5 million to have a special election when it could have been held in November.
Dr. Finch, the question of the June 29th election has been on people's minds, and people saying it's not the best time to have an election about something as important as the Constitution. What's your sense about that?
Well, I think there's 2 points. We've made one already, and that is the fact that this very, very important vote can pass with a simple majority. The supporters of this claim that taxation is so important that it should take a supermajority to pass increased taxes. Well, I would suggest that amending the Iowa Constitution is as important, maybe even more important, than the issue of raising taxes. So why shouldn't that require a supermajority? I think we have some people here speaking in a little different tones here. The June 29th election probably is, or I don't think without doubt, was designed to rush this through, hoping that, quite frankly, a majority of the voters would not understand it. I think in its simplest forms, you go out and you say, doesn't it make sense to make it more difficult for government to raise your taxes? Well, right off the bat, folks are going to say yes. I mean, you don't walk up to someone and say, would you like to have lower taxes, without getting the response. All of us say that. Yes, I would like to have lower taxes. But that's not the whole story. What they need to hear is the whole story. What is it that we're likely not to be able to do? And one of the most important issues is it's likely that we're not going to be able to adequately fund our public schools. And Iowa has historically taken pride in the investment they've made in public schools, and it speaks for itself among the leaders in the nation in every category you can think of. And so now we're going to place that at risk with these amendments.
Good point.
And another point to add to that, in some polling that we did last summer, voters in Iowa clearly said 2 to 1 that they would rather fund additional money to their schools than have a tax cut. We feel that's important information that the public needs to know.
Good. We've talked a little bit about Mr. Stanley and his efforts to do this, what it amounts to basically kind of a crusade. Who are some of the organizations, Jolene, that are opposed to this, that have signed on? I know there's a statewide kind of coalition working on it.
The School Administrators of Iowa, as well as our association, the School Board Association, The American Association of Retired Persons, the AARP, is on board. We have a coalition of 48 different groups, the Library Association, oh golly, help me, Lew, some of the others.
Yeah, well, virtually any organization that represents public officials, publicly elected
Right.
officials,
League
a
of
lot of the
Municipalities,
cities,
cities,
the county
firefighters.
governments, county governments,
cities, firefighters, police
virtually
officers.
any of us who rely very heavily on the legislature for funding. And I mean, that impacts virtually every citizen in this state. We're talking about fire protection, we're talking about police protection, we're talking about education. We're talking about the very elements that constitute quality of life in a state. And it's a real threat.
Another important group that's involved is the League of Women Voters, who have done a tremendous service to many states in organizing forums and so forth for people to become better informed about the election. What's really interesting is we have this state coalition going on, but we also have a lot of local coalitions amongst these same groups. Woodbury County is very active. There's a big group in Waterloo, and Davenport is also very organized in these local groups getting together.
That's good. I know that. I raised that because I know that Mr. Stanley's been quoted as saying he's going to spend $1 million. His organization is going to spend $1 million to convince Iowans that this is a good idea, and I'm sure it'll be a very simplified campaign. I was at his webpage today, and you can't find the amendment. You know, the actual 2,000 words are not. I wasn't able to find it, so it's something that people need to check out and take a look at. And it seems like if this is going to get stopped, it's going to be people talking to one another in communities, like you say.
And I'm not sure. I mean, we think we know what these two amendments are going to do, but there are so many words here that have to be sifted through yet. I'm not sure what the unintended consequences are and what do they really mean. I'm told that the number of words that are in these two amendments are almost half of what's in the United States Constitution. That bothers me. Do we want to put two things into our Constitution with that many words in it that we're not really sure what it means?
It'll be interesting to see as
Yes.
that comes along. Dr. Finch, the Cedar Rapids Gazette on March 16th, Sunday, just yesterday, had a poll that said 86% of Iowans weren't even aware we're going to have an election on June 29th.
Right.
What's going to need to happen to educate all those folks?
Well, the coalition and the Gazette, the media, we're going to have to get out there and inform people. And it's always been my position in the past. I can't tell people how to vote. I mean, people have to make up their mind. This is a democracy, and when people walk into those polls, they're going to make up their own mind. I mean, there's no way we can force them to vote one way or the other. But what we can do is suggest to them to be informed voters. Really look at this proposed. There's a proposed amendments. Look at the data. Look at the information. Look at both sides. Look at both arguments. And arrive at your own conclusions. We have our conclusion, we have our position on it, and I think for the most part, when you have informed voters, they make the right decisions in the long run. I think the real fear that we have is that we're going to have very few people going to the polls on the 29th, and many of those who do go to the polls will be ill-informed about the possible consequences of these proposed amendments. So informed voters is our best bet.
Great. We have a little short presentation that's been submitted by Rusty Martin on the amendments, and we might go to that just in a second. Jolene, do you have any comments for people trying to get informed about this? Any advice to people?
Contact any of those organizations that we just mentioned that are in the coalition for information. Certainly, don't believe everything that you hear. If it sounds too good to be true, it may be. And who is this really good for?
Okay, good. We ready to take a look at that? We have a short presentation that's been presented that kind of describes these amendments. Well, there's a kind of a picture of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Yeah, let's go on. There's the two amendments. The first one limits state spending to 99% of revenues. The second one requires 60% vote to raise taxes. 60% supermajority means minority rules. Big money wants to change the Iowa Constitution. And I see a big property tax increase in your future. Some people are suggesting that there's a focus to keep the state code the way it is, the tax system, freeze it, can't raise taxes, that there's folks that are going to get some substantial benefit by essentially what we already have on the books. And so are we going to go back to that? Very good. And if you invest enough money in the legislators, can you buy your own amendment? Well, maybe you can. We talked a little bit about this. David Stanley, Iowa's super shopper of political favors. He spent lots of money. #1 in PAC funding to the legislature over the last 6 years. Spent money, $750,000. A bunch of that went to one party, Republican Party. We've got a special election, big money protecting unfair tax breaks. That looked like it hurt. We talked about this a little bit. Who knows what these complicated amendments will do? 2,000 words. How many people are even going to read this thing? We hope a lot of people read it because it's a complicated thing, and the Constitution's an important document that ought to embody our principles. And then we finally have this special election, sneak election, special summer vote, $1 million ad blitz, and in this poll we talked about a minute ago, 86% of people don't even know we're having an election about changing our Constitution. We'd like to thank Rusty for submitting that. We thought we'd throw that in at the end, kind of summarize what we've talked about and summarize these issues. Any final comments, advice to people about, or if you want to say what you're going to be doing. I know what I'm going to be doing on June 29th, but
my vote will already be in the bank before that.
You're going to be vote absentee.
Yes,
You can
I
vote.
will, because it's very important that you cast your vote on this issue, and the vote is no, not once, but twice.
Good. Lou, any final comments?
Well, again, I would encourage the voters, the eligible voters, first of all, to vote, and more importantly, to be informed voters. Really take a look at the consequences. And if they have any questions, call either side of this to get clarification. We'd be more than happy to talk with them a little bit about what we would anticipate those consequences to be. And in a nutshell, these two amendments will not be good for public schools in the state of Iowa.
Great. Well, we appreciate both of you being with us. Dr. Lew Finch, Superintendent at Cedar Rapids Schools, and Jolene Franken, President of ISEA, our leading Association of Teachers in Iowa. We'd like to thank you for joining us. These are important questions. You need to get informed about them. I'm not going to be voting yes. I'm going to be voting no twice because I think we shouldn't be mucking around with the Constitution. These are important public policy questions. We ought to put them in the state code, not in the Constitution. So you heard it here. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next time. Arthur New and Richard Myers, State Representative Richard Myers, will be with us to talk about this same set of questions, the constitutional amendments, from just a little bit different perspective. We hope you'll catch that show as well. Remember, this is just a TV program. What's important is what you do each and every day in your community to make it a better place. We're working on it here. It's your turn to do it now. We'll see you next time. Thanks.